Chapter 15, Reconstruction. This chapter concentrates on the history of Reconstruction and the plight of African Americans to gain social, political, and economic acceptance after the Civil War. We are literally rebuilding the United States from the destruction that was caused during the American Civil War. Now, as we'll see, there are several different plans that many different people have about how we should go about this Reconstruction. How should we rebuild the United States? What are we going to do with the South? How are we going to bring it back into the Union? How are we going to reincorporate it into American society? And how are we going to incorporate the newly freed slaves into American society? We'll talk about these different plans. We'll talk about their effects on the South, on different social movements such as feminism. We'll talk about the leaders of America, particularly Andrew Johnson, who turns out to be in charge of most of Reconstruction. These are the things we'll cover in this chapter. So the broad themes, we'll talk quite a bit on the freed slaves' place in American society and how they're going to fit in. We'll talk about this definition of freedom. What does freedom mean to an American? What does it mean to be an American? We'll see the Civil War changes that answer. And then last but certainly not least, we'll get into the individual Reconstruction plans. And out of the many ones that are put forth, we'll concentrate on radical Reconstruction because that is the one that will eventually stick. Now again, just to review, I want to remind you that the Civil War does not start over slavery. It may have been about slavery by the end of the war, but it didn't start over it. The Civil War is a watershed event. It changes everything about the United States. It changes the function and form of the federal government and the President of the United States of America. And so we will see that this Reconstruction process is going to take a lot of this into account. We'll see a highly energized and very powerful federal government. We'll see different questions being raised about American society and various groups' roles in American society. All right, let's talk about this meaning of freedom. After the Civil War, there is a very real question about the definition of freedom. Was freedom the absence of slavery, or did freedom have to do with equal rights? Remember, there is a very real possibility of being a racist abolitionist in this day and age. There were many people who thought that slavery was wrong, if not for moral questions, then for economic questions. For whatever reason, slavery was wrong, but that slaves, even freed slaves, did not have a place in American society. They were not compatible with one another. So this is a very real question. Should former slaves be satisfied because they are no longer slaves? Technically they are free. Or did they have a claim to the same rights as others, white male citizens? This is a very important question, and this is actually a question that over 100 years later we are still struggling to answer. Talking a little bit about social dynamics in the United States, the end of slavery is a huge change in many different ways. One of the biggest changes is the opportunity for former slaves to search for lost family members. One of the biggest dangers to slave families is the fact that any member of the family could be sold away at any time for virtually any reason. And after the end of slavery, the former slaves are now free to search for those members. And there is an argument that with this newfound freedom, that African American family dynamics begin to change, and they begin to pattern themselves after the mainstream nuclear family at that time, which of course would have been a white family. This idea that the father is the dominant figure who goes out and earns a living and brings it back to his family, whereas the woman is expected to follow the husband's lead. She's expected to be a mother to her children and essentially keep the house while the father, the husband, goes out and works during the day. We'll see another change to former slave populations, the beginnings of black churches, especially in the South. Now, most slaves were required to attend church with the master's family, They were not allowed to organize their own churches, and now they could. And this is important because ministers will prove to be very important leaders in early freed slaves communities. The reason for this is, as minister, they already had a position of authority and respect in spiritual matters, and that will be easily transferred onto political matters. Oftentimes, they are the only educated member of the community, and this is especially useful because during the week, most churches are going to function as schools. You go to church there on Sunday, and the rest of the week you go there for school. And these schools are really remarkable institutions because, remember, it is illegal to teach a slave how to read and write under the old slave laws. So in these early days of freed slave schools, you might have typical school-age children that we would think of today. You might have adults. You might have incredibly elderly people who for the first time have access to any sort of education whatsoever. Now, to be sure, these schools are not necessarily formal. They're certainly not supported, at least very much, by the state in forms of taxes or anything of that nature. But for the first time, they do have access to some sort of education. Now, one of the defining characteristics of America is our political participation. If you can't participate in our politics, you're not really a full citizen. That is the thing about the United States. Many people, that is their only reason for coming to the United States, is because they want to engage in politics. And this is going to be one of the gray areas for the freed slaves. They are no longer slaves, but do they have the right to participate in politics? While the government said yes, white society, especially in the South, but not just the South, said no. You should also remember that African Americans are not the only disadvantaged group. Both women and Native Americans in particular do not have full rights, in addition to other naturalized citizens. So again, if you are one of these groups that can't participate in politics, you sort of have a stigma attached to you that you're not really a full citizen. You are a second-class citizen. Another meaning of freedom is the ability to control your own labor. And after the Civil War and after slavery is ended, slaves wanted land, and that is the pure and simple truth. They felt that they had earned the land through generations, in some cases, generations of service. And essentially what they wanted to do was the government to come in, chop up these large plantations, and give the land out to the former slaves. And remember, this is a recurring theme in American history, that in order to be totally free, you have to own land. Now, we have progressed past the point where you have to own land in order to engage in politics. So that's not necessarily a requirement anymore. But still, if you want to control your own labor, if you want to control your own destiny, you have to own your own land, and that's what the slaves want. The federal government is less than willing to do this. The idea of the federal government, and to a lesser extent the Republican Party that is still in charge of the federal government, they did not necessarily want to give out land to the slaves. They wanted to provide jobs for the slaves, and that was really their vision of the United States, where most people would go and work for a wage, usually in some sort of factory. That was their end goal for the United States. They weren't necessarily interested in land ownership for former slaves. So as you can see, most of the time, a black person's definition of freedom will more or less match a white person's. The idea of self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, economic autonomy, so on and so forth. If you ask a freed slave their definition of freedom, it mostly would have matched a white person's. The biggest difference is that for white people, this is a birthright. It is something they are born into. They are born and they have this freedom. Whereas we will see that black people will have to struggle through this process in order to win these rights. And again, 100, 150 years later, we're still making our way through the consequences and repercussions of slavery. Now, from a Southern perspective, obviously, they're not real thrilled about losing the war. In some ways, the South is still not thrilled about losing the war. But at least their grievance is a little bit easier to understand. The South is devastated by the Civil War. Fully 1 in 5 males died as a result of the Civil War. Adult age males, 20% of the male population is gone. The physical destruction of the land. Not only do they lose their slaves, into which they have invested enormous amounts of money, but they also lose the land because, again, it is physically devastated. Fields are burned, towns are burned, so forth and so on. And I think you can make the argument the South has never fully recovered from the effects of the Civil War. And as a result of these things, as you might imagine, most planters are going to define freedom very narrowly for these freed slaves. All right, let's talk about free labor. And we've already touched on this in previous chapters. So this is going to be a sort of a review. But the question is, how do we rebuild the South? What are we going to do with these so-called Confederate states? In their view, they are rejoining the Union. In the Northern view, they never technically left. But of course, everybody knows we have to do something. So how are we going to rebuild the South? Well, the North has a vision. And as you might suspect, what worked for the North, they tried to apply to the South, and they figured it would work down there. Namely, that is the factory system, right? The factory system had provided jobs and wealth and security for the northern states. It was a large reason why they won the Civil War. So, if we can go down and build factories in the South and transform the South and move them away from the slavery and plantation culture and move them closer to this Yankee culture, the Northern culture, that'll be to the South's benefit. And we'll see, maybe not so much. And again, central to Republicans' freedom is this idea of free labor. That's what its vision is based on. The vision is based on free labor. And free labor, of course, is the idea that a man should be able to go out and negotiate a job and wage for what he thinks he's worth, preferably without government interference. And this is directly at odds with slavery, since men asking for wages, they obviously can't compete with slave labor. Maybe a high initial investment, but then you have free labor for the rest of that slave's life. And of course, the Southern philosophy opposes this, saying that slavery is a good thing, because they're providing meaningful jobs and labor to slaves who otherwise won't be able to care for themselves. That argument has basically, by this point, been disproven. Now, the goal is that the South will eventually become like the North. Factories will be built, society will progress, and eventually the entire United States would be unified through our way of life. And of course, as we know, it doesn't. Southern society never really catches up to the North. And even today, in pretty much every measurable metric, whether it's in terms of health or income or education or anything like of that nature, the South reliably is going to lag behind the North. And again, I think part of that, at least, can be traced back to the Civil War. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was the government agency that was tasked with implementing this free labor vision. They were supposed to move throughout the South, set up schools and hospitals. They were trying to integrate former slaves into American society, provide aid to the poor, settle disputes between former slaves and landowners, that sort of thing. Really mixed success. It only lasted for 5 years. It never had enough money or manpower to get the job done that they were supposed to get done. Pretty good at education, pretty good at healthcare, but they were never able to really jumpstart the economy the way that they were supposed to. And again, it all comes down to what people wanted. African Americans wanted land, not jobs. The idea that the North would come into the South and build all these factories and put the former slaves to work for a wage. The slaves didn't want that. They didn't know that lifestyle. They don't want that lifestyle. They want land so they can own their own farms. And at first, the Freedmen's Bureau they tried that. They tried chopping up these plantations and giving them out to the slaves. When Andrew Johnson became president, that practice came to an end. And the fact of the matter is, without land, there is no social mobility. If you were born poor, more than likely you were going to die poor. And part of that is a result of these new labor systems, such as the task system, wage labor, and what become known as sharecropping. Sharecropping, far and away, is the most popular of these new labor systems. In sharecropping, a tenant farmer, someone who rents the land, they don't have land of their own, a tenant farmer works the land of the landowner. In return for the use of the land, the tenant farmer would pay a portion of the harvest, his quote-unquote share of the crop, as rent. The problem with this is that the system is completely controlled by the landowner. The tenant farmer doesn't have a whole lot of leverage. So when it comes time to set the terms of the rental agreement, he is at a disadvantage. These newly freed slaves have barely the clothes on their back. So starting seed and tools and things of that nature they have to get, and who are they going to get them from? Well, they're going to get them from the landowner. And what would happen is they over time they build up this huge debt. This huge debt. Every year they dig a deeper and deeper hole. All it takes is one bad year when your crop does not come in, you're not able to pay off the debts. You know, the idea is you rent the land, you harvest the crop, you pay off your debt with part of your crop, and then you're left with part of the crop as profit. Well, it very rarely, if ever, worked that way. In most years, all they were doing was digging a deeper hole for themselves. And so these landowners frequently take advantage of their tenant farmers. And the other thing about this is that this doesn't just affect poor black farmers, it also affects poor white farmers. It's a very vicious cycle, and like I say, once you have one bad year, once you dig that hole just a little bit, it becomes increasingly difficult to get yourself out of that situation. All right, let's talk about Reconstruction, the actual political plans for Reconstruction. There are three views on Reconstruction: conservative, radical, and moderate. The conservative view was the easiest. They wanted a quick and easy reunification. They don't want to attach a whole lot of strings. The radical was the harshest. Not only did they want to transform the South into something that it wasn't, they wanted to punish the South for their role in slavery. And of course, moderate is a mixture of the two. And as we've mentioned before, Lincoln was a moderate. He wanted a quick and easy reunification. And he did attach some strings. There were some stipulations, but by and large, he wanted the states to come back fairly easily. Remember, in his mind, the states never really left the Union. So what his plan is known as the 10% plan. Lincoln promised general amnesty and restoration of property if they would pledge a loyalty oath. Essentially, if you were a member of the Confederacy, as long as you promised to never fight against the Union ever again, you would be forgiven and your property, except for slaves, would be restored, because you did have to accept the abolition of slavery. That was non-negotiable. Slavery was over. When 10% of the eligible voters of a state took the oath, then they could gather together, write a new constitution, and a new state government could be set up. That's pretty easy. All you have to do is promise never to fight against the Union again. When you get 10% of the population who are willing to swear that, you can create a new state constitution. That's a pretty low bar to rejoining the Union. And in fact, we will see that it's not enough for radical Republicans. They're not happy with this. They think that it's going way too easy on the South. And so they come up with their own plan. Now, write this down, underline it, circle it, star it, whatever. The Wade-Davis bill never becomes law. This is just something that they put out there. This is something they would like to see done. The Wade-Davis bill never becomes law, but it shows what the radical Republicans want out of Reconstruction. For example, States would no longer be able to choose their own governor, at least not in the early days. The president would appoint them their own governor. Not 10%, but 50% of the population would be required to take an oath. And this oath is not a loyalty oath saying that you would never in the future fight against the Union. This is what's known as the ironclad oath. The ironclad oath was you swore that you had never fought against him. Not that you wouldn't fight in the future, but the ironclad oath said that you had never in the past fought against the Union. There's probably not 50% of the population of the South at this point that can truthfully say they had never borne arms against the Union. So this was ridiculous on its face. States must abolish slavery. Again, that's non-negotiable. But then it goes even further than that. They must disenfranchise. That means strip away the right to vote. Civil and military leaders lose the right to vote, and the states must pay all the war debts. So as you can see, much stricter, much harsher than Lincoln's quick and easy reunification. And as I mentioned, the Wade-Davis bill never became law. And in fact, Lincoln's plan is not around for very long, because, as we all know, April 1865, Lincoln will be assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate conspirator. As a matter of fact, Lincoln was just one victim out of many that was intended that night. They not only targeted Lincoln, but also his vice president, Secretary of State William Seward, who actually was injured in an attack. But Lincoln's was the only successful assassination. But okay, Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865, just a few weeks after the end of the war, and Andrew Johnson, his vice president, is going to become the acting president. Now, Johnson is an interesting guy. He is most definitely a self-made man, very little formal schooling. He was educated largely by his wife. He was a tailor by trade before he got into politics. He made clothes for a living. He serves as state legislature, governor. He's a member of the U.S. Senate until eventually he becomes a vice president. Johnson is a defendant of states' rights, and we spoke about states' rights before. It's this idea that the federal government does not have jurisdiction over the states for whatever reason. And he most definitely believed that Reconstruction should be handled by the executive branch rather than by the legislative branch, that handling of Reconstruction was a prerogative of the president rather than Congress. And he has his own plan for Reconstruction, commonly referred to as presidential restoration. So, what were the terms of Johnson's restoration? Well, number one, he also promised amnesty for oath takers. He only required the loyalty oath rather than the ironclad oath, although there was a stipulation that if you were a high-ranking member of the Confederacy, either civil or military, you might have to apply in person, but okay. The president would appoint a provisional governor over the territory. You did have to accept the abolishment of slavery. You had to essentially take back secession. You had to revoke secession. And you did have to pay your debts. So not as harsh as Wade-Davis, but more strict than Lincoln's plan. So it was sort of in the middle of two. And as it turns out, most Republicans are willing to try out his plan and just see what happens. And as a matter of fact, by December of 1865, Johnson stands up and declares that Reconstruction is over. All the states that had seceded have rejoined the Union either under Lincoln's plan earlier or later under Johnson's plan. So he says Reconstruction is over, the Union is once again made whole. Radical Republicans are not okay with this. Radical Republicans refuse to acknowledge these new state governments. because they're angry. They're angry about old Confederate leaders being allowed back into office. They're angry about the discriminatory laws being passed against African Americans known as the Black Codes. And they believe that safeguards are needed from the federal government to protect the newly freed slaves. So most radical Republicans are looking to change Johnson's plan. They want to extend the Freedmen's Bureau. They want to sign into law the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which would have granted black people citizenship in the United States. And Johnson vetoed both. Johnson says you can't do that. It violates states' rights. He says you cannot confer citizenship to African Americans. The Dred Scott decision handed down by the Supreme Court has already told us that they are not citizens. And so essentially what's going to happen is Johnson, who is of course a Republican, is picking a fight with congressional Republicans. Congress is going to override his veto and decided to implement their own Reconstruction bill, their own plan for Reconstruction. One part of their new plan is going to be the 14th Amendment, which builds into the Constitution. It's not a law that can maybe later be repealed. This builds it into the Constitution. 14th Amendment says that all people born in the United States are citizens. It also provides for what's known as the Due Process Clause, which means that each person has equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment is the second of three Civil War era amendments that you need to know about. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made the former slaves citizens and provided for due process. The other terms of what will become known as radical Reconstruction are thus. First thing is that the South will be placed under martial law. Congress will divide the Confederate States into 5 military districts that are going to be patrolled by the United States Army. Voters had to create a new state government that would protect black suffrage and ratify the 14th Amendment. And once that is done, you don't really get to choose your own constitution because Congress has to approve the new constitution. So as you can see, maybe not quite as harsh as Wade Davis, but much, much harsher than either presidential plan. Congress isn't done yet because they also moved to limit Johnson's control. They passed several laws that would restrict the power of the president. Johnson, of course, will resent this. He's angered by this, and he deliberately broke one of these laws to prove that he was in charge. As a result, he is the first president ever impeached. Now, I do want to make a short note here. Being impeached does not mean that you are removed from office. Bill Clinton was impeached. He was actually the second president to be impeached. Being impeached, really all that means is that you're essentially being charged with a crime, sort of. It's a two-step process. The first thing that happens is the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, gets together, they look at the evidence, and they say, okay, there is enough evidence that you might have broken the law. And so we need to move on to a trial. That's being impeached. When the House of Representatives says there's enough evidence you may have broken a law, we need to go to trial to find out for sure, that is being impeached. Being impeached is standing trial. And then at the actual trial, the Senate, the upper house of Congress, is going to act as your jury. They vote on whether or not you are guilty. Bill Clinton was impeached. He stood trial before the Senate. He was overwhelmingly found not guilty. Johnson came within one vote of being removed from office. If one senator had voted one way or the other, had voted the other way, he possibly could have been the first and would have been only president ever removed from office. No American president has ever been removed from office. Well, obviously, the rest of the Republican Party is not thrilled with Johnson. So the election of 1868, they're going to run a new Republican candidate, the hero of the Civil War for the Northern forces, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is going to win, and his victory is going to lead Congress to approve the 15th Amendment, the third of the Civil War era amendments. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment made freed slaves citizens and provided for due process. And the 15th Amendment is going to protect voting rights. 15th Amendment says you cannot restrict the right to vote due to race. Of course, we'll see that that is exactly what is done a little bit later. But okay, fine. Something I want to talk about right now is the Great Constitutional Revolution, which is something that in American history is really rather remarkable and pretty interesting to boot. It's kind of a complicated process, so I want you to just stick with me for just a moment here. Because after the Civil War, we've actually got a couple of different things happening. On the one hand, we have a newly empowered national state. The federal government after the Civil War is as powerful as it has ever been in American history up to that point. Obviously, today's federal government is much more powerful. But to that point, in 1865, immediately after the Civil War, the federal government is as powerful as it had ever been in American history. Plus, now we have this idea of national citizens that are equal before the law. Those two things combined give us what is known as the Great Constitutional Revolution. So here we go. Civil War, as I mentioned, represents a huge growth in federal power, not just in fighting the war, but we have finally answered the question on states' rights. Who has more power, the federal government or the state governments? Well, the North won the war, so their philosophy won out. The federal government is going to be more powerful than the state governments. And we have this idea of a national citizen. Race is no longer based on biology. You no longer have to have a certain color of skin in order to be an American citizen. So when you take this newly empowered national government and you combine it with this idea that race, that citizenship is no longer based on biology, and that under the due process, equal protection was available to all citizens under the law, it means that you have to look at the United States government in a completely different view. Remember that in the days of the American Revolution, immediately after the ratification of the Constitution, the first order of business was to provide for a Bill of Rights. And the reason that the Founding Fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson, wanted a Bill of Rights in the Constitution was they were afraid of strong government. They wanted safeguards for the American citizens to protect against the actions of government. So, when you have something in the Bill of Rights that says you have the freedom of speech, what they really meant was that the government, or at least the federal government, would not restrict your speech. A powerful government was something to be feared, so you had to have protections built in against that powerful government. Your right to bear arms would not be infringed upon by the government. You would not be subject to cruel and unusual punishment by the government. The Bill of Rights was designed to protect against governmental actions. After the Civil War, this has changed. Now the federal government is tasked with protecting the rights of its citizens against those that would take them away. Now the powerful federal government is not something to be feared, but it's the only thing strong enough to protect the rights of its citizens. So you see, it is a complete 180. It is a complete reversal. It goes from the Bill of Rights is protected against, is there to protect us against governmental action, to all of a sudden the government is supposed to protect our rights. So within the span of just 80 years, that is a complete flip-flop on the view of the job of the federal government. That's a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. Okay. Let's talk about the boundaries of freedom, and actually this is a very short section because I do want you to realize that Reconstruction is for the freed slaves and no one else. It does have very real limits. We still see discrimination against other racial groups, most notably Asians out west. We see discrimination, of course, against Native Americans. We see discrimination against women. And again, we've mentioned this before, the fact that the Constitution now protected voting rights for race and not gender will lead some feminists to split off from the radical Republicans. Women that have been some of the leading abolitionists of their day are upset that rights are being extended to freed slaves and not to women. So it does draw some support away from the Republican Party. Okay. Let's talk about radical Reconstruction in the South. For the first time in American history, black people are going to be encouraged to organize politically, at least in the South. At least in the South, for the first time. Under radical Reconstruction, African American rights are going to be more protected than ever before. Most of them do feel a sense of loyalty. Almost all African Americans join the Republican Party. And that is going to lead to most of the South being controlled by the Republican Party. By 1870, all states had rejoined under what's known as Congressional Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, those are the exact same things. And due to these former slaves' preference for the Republican Party, that is a major population shift in favor of the Republican Party. And we actually see many black people winning office. Now, most of the time it was a local office. You know, they're running for local town positions or maybe county positions, maybe a few state positions. But we do see several black men being elected into Congress for the first time in American history. We also see some white people increasing in power, such as carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers, that's the derogatory name for Northerners who moved to the South after the Civil War. Scalawags are Southerners who supported the Republican Party. Generally speaking, these Republican governments aren't going to be very well received by white populations in the South. The important thing is not that a lot of these Republican governments fail, which they will do, but the fact that they got anything accomplished at all is really something of a miracle. And again, their main goal, their vision is to transform the South into something like the North. It really is only partially successful. Most black people are going to remain poor with few opportunities to move up in the world. Most of the money earmarked for developing the South is actually going to make its way out west instead. But the right to vote was great. Black men being elected to office was great. A biracial government is great. And in fact, we're going to see that it's too much for some people. Let's talk about the overthrow of Reconstruction because, as mentioned, the white leaders of the South do not like these new Republican-led governments. And, you know, you can make the argument, yes, some of these governments were corrupt. Yes, taxes to support this new economic development, these new hospitals, these new schools. Yes, taxes were high, but mainly what they were angry about were black people with power. And we're going to see that they will launch a campaign of violence to overcome Reconstruction. Now, black people in the South had always faced violence. They were always... there was always the danger of violence against black people. But after the Civil War, the violence is going to become political. That is, that violence is going to be used to try and sway people's political opinions. And there's a name for that. It's called terrorism. And we will see the growth of domestic terrorist organizations in the South. And this, of course, is an early picture of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan... it is basically a terrorist organization. Not only did they attack black people, but they attacked white supporters of equal rights as well. They attacked Republicans. They attacked people, anyone who was different. Foreign nationals, Catholics in the South, and they would respond with violence. And of course, eventually this violence is going to become rebellious. It gets to such a state that the state governments can no longer control it, and they're actually going to have to call in the federal army. Congress is going to pass a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts, which will destroy the Civil War era KKK. I do want to point that out, that the Ku Klux Klan of the Civil War era is a very different organization. The modern day Ku Klux Klan did not come into being until the 1920s or so. So it's two completely different organizations. A lot of their views are the same, but two completely different organizations. And what we see happening is, as a result of this violence, as time goes on, the North's commitment to Reconstruction really begins to wane. It begins to lessen as we move further away from the Civil War. We're seeing new Republicans being elected to office, and oftentimes these new Republicans are not nearly committed to the idea of Reconstruction as their elders were. And eventually we're going to see the Republican Party split over the idea of Reconstruction. Some people make the argument that they had done all they could for the South. The South should now be left to its own devices. And you, again, have the older people who say that, no, we need to continue down this road. And what we see happen is that the North does begin to back away from Reconstruction. And as the Republicans begin to back off, Democrats began to recapture positions of power in the South. These Democrats that will retake power will be known as the Redeemers. The Redeemers. Which brings us up to the election of 1876. The election of 1876 is going to be fought between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who runs against the Democrat Samuel Tilden. It is incredibly close, coming down to a handful of states. And the end result of the election of 1876 will come down to this. Essentially, the Democrats will concede the presidency to the Republican candidate, who is Hayes, if the Republican Party would agree to end Reconstruction and pull out of the South. And this is regarded as the bargain of 1877. By 1877, Reconstruction and Republican power in the South will essentially be over. Now, of course, 100 years later, 120 years later, the Republicans have retaken the South, but that's a very different story. As the Republicans pull out, the South will once again be ruled by the Democratic Party. They're known as the Redeemers. They're known as the Bourbons. Now, it's actually kind of interesting because the Bourbons are going to adopt the Republican plan for the South. They want to economically develop the South. They want to build factories. They want to build railroads. They want to build banks. They want to, they want to out-Yankee the Yankee. They want to beat the North at its own game. So it's really kind of interesting that even though the Republican Party pulls out, the Democratic Party is going to adopt its vision for the South. Now, again, it doesn't really happen. For all their efforts, they were only able to get the South up to pre-war levels. And, of course, the South is still overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. This idea that they're fighting for, this so-called New South, is never going to arrive, especially not for the freed slaves, especially not for Native Americans. And, in fact, we will see that many freed slaves are going to flee the South, a mass migration of freed slaves to the North, known as the Exodus. Many are able to leave, but many also had to stay. They simply did not have the means to pick up and leave. And we see that they are forced to fight for their own opportunities. They have to carve out opportunities for themselves. Men like Booker T. Washington here, pictured here, stressed education for the freed slaves, saying that that was their avenue to acceptance. That's their avenue to integrating and assimilating into white society. White people, however, will not accept the equality of black people. Really, in the South, black people only had rights because of the federal government, and after 1877, there's not even that protection anymore. Without federal protection, black rights in the South are going to be steadily whittled away. The real low point came from the U.S. Supreme Court. Once again, after the Dred Scott decision, they will hit another low point with the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed for the rule known as separate but equal. They ruled that discrimination is legal as long as these separate facilities were equal in stature. And of course, we know that they never were equal, but that was the legal fallacy that they agreed on. As long as the facilities were equal, they were allowed to be separate. We began to see a pattern of disenfranchisement through things like literacy tests. In order to vote, you have to be able to prove that you can read and write. Well, of course, most newly freed slaves had no formal education at all, and they could not read and write. In order to vote, you have to pay a poll tax. Of course, newly freed slaves barely have the clothes on their backs. They don't have any money. They don't have any property. They can't afford to pay these poll taxes. We begin to see Jim Crow laws, legalized segregation, that will rule the South until the 1950s and 60s. We will see more racial violence through lynching in the South. Hundreds of people a year are lynched. Black people are lynched in the South. And we see the rise of a new type of politician known as the Southern demagogue. Demagogues are politicians that appeal to the basest emotions of humans. They run on messages of fear and hatred and bigotry. They tell white society in the South that black people are to blame for all of their misfortunes, and if they just put them in charge, the demagogue in charge, they won't have to worry anymore. This is Jeff Davis, who was one of the leading Southern demagogues in the South following the Civil War. He's actually going to be in Arkansas. He's going to serve as governor of Arkansas from 1901 to 1907. And then later in 1907, he's going to serve in the United States Congress as a senator from Arkansas. And he's going to be famous for his speeches railing against equal rights in the United States. And again, they rose to power on the fears that people have. They rose to power on hatred and bigotry, and telling people what's wrong with the world instead of actually how to fix it. And we will see that type of politician, unfortunately, is going to dominate the South for another 100 years.